So we're moving to an interesting time in this series of Expanding Your Table. One of the 4 real values of this church, and you can see all 4 of them if you just head out to the parking lot, kind of in that direction. They're all 4 right on the side of the building, is this idea of hospitality, but a certain kind of hospitality, extreme hospitality. And that's even on our website. If you look on the website and you go to our real values, you'll see extreme hospitality, real hope goes the extra mile. It's one of the 4 key values. These key values is what drives the leadership of St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church. And I got to tell you, in my work and the stuff that I do, I am so grateful that this church that I get to be aligned with for this season is committed to these 4 values, and that one is important, and that's at the heart of this, expand your table. Extreme is a really interesting word. It's with words like awesome, incredible, unbelievable, amazing, that are these words that, you know, are really reserved for the extraordinary. They're words that you really should use just sparingly when you're like extreme hospitality, as opposed to like amazing, incredible, vulnerable, unbelievable Brussels sprouts. You know, a Brussels sprout can't actually ever be, let's admit it, amazing. Now, granted, at your restaurant, in a place called Town in La Crescenta, they say they're really good, but they're not unbelievable. Now, come on, let's not go that far. But extreme hospitality. Now, why is that important? Because the word hospitality does not belong to Christians. The word hospitality is simply what civil people in every culture see as a normative part of life. You treat people with relative kindness and respect. That is a value system that is in every single culture. It's part of being a society. Extreme hospitality, when we use the word well, not when we use it like X Games, extreme X Games. ESPN kind of owns it. Well, great, but extreme sports, all that means is the kind of sports that only a crazy person would ever try it. Let's be honest. Like a middle school kid or somebody that went to Stanford. Okay, these are the kind of people that would try those things. That's funny if you have ever heard of it, but nonetheless. Extreme, over the top, way extraordinary, way unusual. What does it mean for a group of people that kind of align together, known as a church, to exhibit extreme hospitality? That's one thing leading into this particular sermon. The other was, as Brandon mentioned and sang about it, was the last 8 days has been pretty doggone wild. And I'm sure that most of us, if not almost all of us, are coming in even to this service with all kind of different feelings, all kind of convictions, all kind of attitudes. Things that kind of ramp us up or at least confuse us. This has been a week of chaos in terms of the voices. Who do you trust? Where do you turn? What speaks into our life in this cacophony of noise that constantly gets our attention, that causes us to worry, to wonder, to react, to defend, to defy? And this is tough, because what's interesting is the text for this morning. I picked 3 months ago when we decided we were going to do this Extreme Hospitality, Expanding Your Table series. And yet this text kind of speaks right into this, and here's why. I worked for Young Life for about 15 years before I started being a professor. That's what I've been doing for a long time now, is a professor at seminary. And before I did that, I worked for this organization called Young Life, which works with primarily high school, some college and middle school kids and others, but primarily high school students, to try to help them to see that Jesus Christ matters and loves them. But my job with Young Life in the last couple of years of my role there was to be the regional director of Northern Colorado, primarily Denver, Northern Colorado, and some of the surrounding states. And so my job was to oversee multiple Young Life staff people in these cities where they had these ministries. And this was a time of great chaos. This was a time when there was a lot of struggle and disunity. The local urban and multi-ethnic office was in Denver, and Young Life headquarters was in Colorado Springs. Denver was my region, and Colorado Springs was the headquarters. It wasn't in our region, so there was political fights just structurally There was racial arguments, there was racial tension, there was economic and justice issues, and the mission was literally breaking apart during those years. And I was the youngest regional director in the country at the time, and I was too young to have this role, but I got asked to speak to the gathering of regional directors on the issue of unity. Yeah, seriously. And so I was struggling with what to say, writing some stuff. Well, in the course of my life, I had the opportunity to have some really great people that have kind of come alongside me and put up with me and taught me things. And one of them was a guy named Bob Mitchell. He was president of Young Life for 11 years before this happened. He had retired from that, but I still got to meet with Mitch occasionally. And we were having breakfast, and I told him that I was doing this thing on unity. And he goes, well, I just got to tell you, when you need to deal with unity, you don't speak on unity. You talk about Jesus. Because it's at Jesus' feet that when we come together disunified, struggling, in chaos, hearing multiple voices, at the feet of Jesus, it levels the playing field. And all of a sudden truth comes pouring out at us that causes us to cock our head a little bit, to listen a little more carefully to him instead of the voices, to pay more attention to what he has to say to us. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to listen to the voice of Jesus this morning. And it's on page 1545, those of you that are kind of new to this world, and I encourage all of you to at least have access to a Bible because we're going to be going through this text. It's Matthew chapter 25, starting at verse 31. And this is the voice of Jesus, the words of Jesus Christ himself. Matthew 25, verses 31 to the end of the chapter. I invite you, if you're able, to stand to hear what God has to say to us in a world of confusion and anger. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it for me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me." They also will answer, "Lord, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or needing clothes or sick or in prison and did not help you?" He will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me." Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. This is literally the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God indeed. You may have a seat. Thank you. Wow. Wow, what a passage, huh? Kind of stark, kind of right there. Where does it begin? It begins with Jesus reminding us of who he is. The title, Son of Man, is a title that he used a lot, especially in the book of Matthew, for himself, that came out of the Old Testament, that God himself had invaded human history and was with us. And this was a fully human person who was also fully God. That's the title, Son of Man. And who's the Son of Man comes in his glory with all the angels. He'll sit on the glorious throne. When you think about Jesus, it's kind of easy sometimes when we move through kind of the Christian thing to reduce Jesus to being a good friend or somebody there that's there to help us, as opposed to remembering that this is the King that sits on the throne. This is really interesting. If you've been around the church at all, or if you ever looked at the Bible, and I encourage some of you guys to spend as much time as you can in the Bible, especially if you are into voices, if you listen to the radio or other devices or cable TV or whatever it is that kind of comes at you all the time, or driving in your car. These voices come at us so many times. How do we know who to listen to? How do we know what to think? How do we get all worked up to live in a certain way, especially with all this noise and chaos around us? When we have access to Jesus himself reminding us of who he is and who we are. So those of you that are, maybe you drive in your car instead of listening to the radio, maybe may want to try listening to some kind of books on CD or through Bluetooth somehow on your phone on BibleGateway.com or something like that. Maybe we ought to figure out how to filter a little bit to hear this King speaking to us. And what's interesting in the book of Matthew is it looks like how God inspired Matthew to put it together is the opening public teaching ministry of Jesus is recorded in Matthew 5-7 called the Sermon on the Mount. If you read Matthew 5-7, that's pretty radical stuff right there. That's extreme hospitality. And that's, what does it mean to live? How has God designed his universe? And what does it mean to actually recognize God has in how we treat the world and especially people? And then the last public teaching ministry of Jesus is right here. Isn't that interesting? Opens with what's called the Sermon on the Mount, how God wants us to live. Closes with what's called Sermon on Judgment, of really what it comes down to of all of life is how we lived our lives. And that's how Matthew frames this. So we're now at this kind of pinnacle of Jesus' public teaching is recorded in Matthew. So what's going on here? Well, we got two groups of people. The King will draw all the nations together at the end of all things. And all humanity that's ever existed, I know we can't even imagine this, but this is the King talking, lips of Jesus. And he separates them, the sheep from the goats. The sheep on the one side and the goats on the other. And as he separates the sheep and the goats, people have been thinking ever since, oh, this is kind of weird. Is that what? So the sheep are the good guys, the good ones, and the goats are the bad ones. Yuck. All right? And so they got these, it's almost we think that there's two different flocks in a family or a household that owns a bunch of sheep and goats, that you'd hire one person, Harvey, to take care of the sheep, and another person, Sarah, to handle the goats. Well, that's not how it worked. If you had sheep and goats, you had enough money to have sheep and goats, you hired one shepherd who was pretty good and got a few assistants, and you threw them all together. So the sheep and the goats were flocked together when they went out into the wilderness, and only when they would come back and you needed to separate them for whatever reason, you would separate the sheep from the goats because they had two different roles to play in life in the ancient world. So it's not that sheep are good and goats are bad, it's just a metaphor for describing two groups of people. That's what Jesus is doing here. So let's first look at the goats. Starting at verse 41, he'll say to those on his left, the goats, "Depart from me, for you are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you didn't invite me in. I needed clothes, and you decided not to clothe me. I was sick, and I was in prison, and you chose not to look after me." I want you to notice something. Look at the response of the goats. If you got your Bible there, look at verse 44. Here's what they say first. Notice this. Lord. That's a title. The word Lord, kurios, is a word that means absolutely authority. You are my king, in essence. You are the one I am aligned with. I will have no other voices that grab my attention. You will be the one that I will follow. So when you say Lord, you are asserting your allegiance to Jesus Christ and his kingdom. So the goats said, Lord, when did we see you hungry, thirsty, a stranger, naked, sick, in prison? When did we see all this happen in us? Had we known it was you, Lord, oh, we love you. We, of course, would have done whatever you needed because you are the one we're giving our life to. That's why they use the word Lord. But see, the goats didn't see him. They could call him Lord all they want to, but the goats couldn't find him. Didn't know he was there. The goats walked by the need of humanity. That's the goats. Same thing happened with the sheep. As you see, the sheep, same thing. Verse 35, I was hungry. You gave me something to eat. Thirsty. You gave me something to drink. Stranger, you invited me in. Come on. Needed clothes. You clothed me. I was sick. You looked after me. I was in prison. You came to visit me. And then the righteous will say the same thing. Lord. The sheep go, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, etc.? And that's when the king replies to them. The difference between the sheep and the goats, they both use the title Lord. The goats would have served Jesus, but didn't have time for the stranger. See, by the way, a stranger is not really a stranger. A stranger is only a stranger to me. A stranger is not a stranger to their mom, their closest friend, and especially their Lord. See, we're the ones that separate. We're the ones that make distinctions. We're the ones that deny the full life to one another. We're the ones that walk by others and call them the least. And the goats, see, if it was Jesus, a different ballgame, I'm in. But because it was those others, they walked right on by. What about the sheep? Sheep said, well, we didn't know it was you. We didn't see you. You were there. But what was it about the sheep that they would do those things? Because they practiced and exhibited an extreme hospitality, not to earn their salvation, but to exhibit their faith in Jesus. See, they knew the shepherd, and the shepherd knew them, and they knew the shepherd's heart, and they realized the shepherd was with these ones who were in need. So therefore the sheep simply lived their life and poured their life into the needs of others. Because that's the heart of the shepherd. That's what the king's up to. And if I'm going to follow Jesus and I'm really going to call him Lord, that's my vocation. My vocation is not where I get my paycheck or what I major in or what company I own. My vocation is I'm a servant of the king. That's what I do when I'm in Christ. That's the sheep. I learned a big lesson on this one when I was regional director for Young Life Again. That's why I told you that, because I was in charge of greater Denver and in northern Colorado at the time. And one of the areas that we had going was in northeast Denver. And at that time, northeast Denver was predominantly African American, seriously poor, a very tough community. And a woman had been there for a while, Reverend Yvonne McCoy, who had run a children's choir there for a while. And that's how she was helping kids to kind of come out of poverty and get some health around them. And so she went on Young Life staff. So I became Yvonne's boss. She was about 4'11", little tiny thing, and 3 feet of hair. And then she wore these huge, heels that made her taller than me. So I was intimidated right off the bat. Little tiny woman, but huge personality. And Yvonne was great. She taught me a lot, older than me, more experienced, wiser, much more vocal, and way more powerful. That's Yvonne. So part of my job as regional director was to help raise money, especially for those communities that had no way to raise dough. So what we'd do is I'd take Yvonne and we'd go to different churches and we'd try to raise some money from churches. And there was this one church that really loved Young Life and really loved Yvonne's ministry and what was going on there, and they'd given in the past. So we really asked for, especially at that time, a lot of money to help them out. They're in desperate straits. So we asked the missions committee for $10,000 to help support Yvonne's ministry. And so they said, well, okay, let's have a meeting after church. You guys come to the services, and you be in the services. And then we'll have the meeting with the missions committee afterwards. So Yvonne and I were off in you ever seen those churches? We got them at the 8 and 9:30 where they got the big chairs, the kind that Jesus used to sit in. You know, those kind of, and we're sitting, and she looked like Lily Tomlin, like a little girl, you know, because her feet were, she's so dinky, and he's just like this. And the pastor was this guy that really meant well, but needed a little education or something. He needed something, need friends or whatever. But he went in this long deal about those poor, awful, terrible, hurting, urban, inner city kids in Northeast Denver. Well, Yvonne, the more he's talking, the more he's just sticking his size 10 right down his throat. As Yvonne's getting madder and madder, and she's just getting ticked, and her leg starts, just kicking like crazy. And I got a fake knee, and I'm doing that. And as she's doing it, I'm thinking, 10 grand, Yvonne, 10 grand, stop, shh, knock it off, 10 grand. Well, finally this guy says, and what's so wonderful about Reverend Yvonne McCoy is she's bringing Jesus to these unfortunate kids. And she completely lost it. She jumps up from her seat. Oh, great, there it goes. Okay, she runs to the deal. She pushes this pastor aside. Big church, bigger than St. Andrew's and absolutely packed. Pushes the guy aside, grabbed the mic. In those days, there's a mic, we don't have it up here, but one of those mics that goes real loud, Pulls it down to her height, hair, just huge. And he goes, I got one thing to say to you people. I'm just horrified. Am I going to even get off the stage? She says, I didn't bring Jesus to those kids. Jesus was there a long time before I showed up. I go to look for Jesus. 20 grand. Awesome. That pastor was dumbfounded. I was sitting there. That's the Yvonne I knew and loved. She wasn't going to put up with it, man, but she was saying the truth. We got to look for Jesus because Jesus is in the midst of ordinary broken humanity. Jesus was there. Jesus was not only there, but he was among them. And that's when we look at this and you got the sheep and you got the goats and you got the separation. Well, what's the kind of the situation? What's the criteria for separating them? And then who are they actually talking about with the ones that needed help? So first, with what's going on as they separated them, well, what you see there as we separate them is this list that I've read several times now, and maybe you're getting tired of me saying, I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was a stranger. And maybe the list you're going, yeah, I get it. Well, it's interesting in this text, it sure looks like Jesus said it over and over and over because he absolutely means it. Here's the list. You see it up there, and I've mentioned it several times. Is the list of these needs. Now, at first glance, when you look at this list, you go, well, that's, okay, I get it, that list. I can summarize the list, especially, the first 3 or 4 especially. We think of homeless people or ones that are obviously in need right in front of us, and the great dilemma of what do we do? So, yeah, we think homeless. Then we think sick that have nobody. Okay, that's an obvious one. Yeah, we ought to be doing something about that. What about those in prison? Notice that it never says anywhere in prison and don't deserve it. We love to separate those who deserve their outcomes of their life from those who do not deserve it. And Jesus does not do that. I was sick and I was in prison. But at first glance, the obvious ones, sure. And then we kind of want to go there. But this is not meant to be an exhaustive list that's limited to the homeless or really severe situations. This is a description of humanity when we find ourselves experiencing the brokenness of simply growing up in a world that still is, the kingdom's come, but it's not yet quite accomplished its mission to pull all things together. So this list, for example, thirsty isn't just about liquids. Thirst is the human drive that Jesus Christ built into each one of us. I thirst for justice. Love that in your song. Let justice roll. That's actually biblical, that line, if you didn't know, if you didn't recognize it. The human person thirsts for justice. The human person is hungry for dignity and value. The human person feels like a stranger in the midst of great company, whether it's a family or a community or a large city, in a nation that says one nation under God, indivisible, but they can feel like a stranger in their own nation. In other words, this list is not simply about somebody that we can readily identify as being so far gone that, of course, Christ wants us to help them. No, the what is all around us is need. Everywhere we look are people that deeply struggle and are desperate for somebody to help them to move in the direction of the life that God has for them. John 10:10, I have come to give you life and life to the fullest. That's the human person. And there's not one that has ever existed that doesn't hunger and thirst for the opportunity to become a full, whole person and experience what God has for them. That's the what. I was these things in a holistic way. Some of you knew me enough that you stepped in. I love the line that's there a couple of times in the text. Look after me. The sheep look after them. The sheep proactively invested. The sheep realized this is the game. This is my vocation. It's the goats that said, had we known it was you, Lord, we want to make sure, man, we want to be with you. But somehow could not see that to be with Jesus meant to be in the midst of the ordinary, broken, lost, sad, oppressed, failures. And who actually are they that we're talking about? Well, that's what's really interesting. Verse 40 of Matthew 25 is one of the most debated verses there is in all of the Gospels. A couple of reasons why. Take a look at this. The king will reply when they say, when did we see you? Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these, let's stop there, least of these. Does that ever strike you? Whether you're at school, or you're in a neighborhood, or you're in a family, or you're watching the news. Who's the least? Is Jesus saying that there's some people that are least and then there's the rest of us that are not? Is that his point? I do, when you're a graduate school professor, especially at a place like Fuller Seminary, I do a lot of traveling. I get a chance to be in a lot of different places and speak to a lot of different folks about different stuff. And I was at this one church in Washington, D.C., again, another large church, 5 services, and I was going to do a parent seminar at night to help people that realize how wonderful kids are, by the way. And so I was doing this sermon, and when I was done with it, like the third one, this mom and dad and kid, 25-year-old, sorry, that's how old I am. They kind of came up to me, and the mom was vocal, and she said, hey, this is our son. He's going to be coming to Fuller next year, and I wanted you to meet him so you could kind of greet him and be his friend, and help him out. And I said, I'd love to do that. That was great. And then she went on, and he's kind of sheepish at this point. She put her arm around him, and the dad's just standing back like this. She puts her arm around him and kind of comes right up to me and says, oh, you're going to love him. He's just the greatest. He's doing so much for the world. In fact, he's done inner city ministry, and she winks. And he's serving the last 2 years, he's serving the least of the least. Everything in me started just, and I had a rare thing called a filter. Because I figured, I'll let the kid come to Fuller, we'll teach him good theology, and he can go back and work on his mom for the next several decades. But think about that. The least of the least. The other, the worst. See, the goats really, they were into the least because they realized that I'll pay attention to you, Lord, but don't ask me to go into the midst of the least. Well, Jesus' point is not that there are some that are least and some that are not. The word least is used most often for children in the Gospels, and it actually is a term that means vulnerable. It means anybody who's needy with anything. It means anybody who's ordinary, anybody who's sad, anybody who's oppressed, anybody who's been beaten down, whether by their own failure or the circumstances they find themselves in. The voices that come at us constantly are talking about the least. But the king says, those people belong to me. In fact, look at the next line. Whatever you did for one of the least of these, brothers and sisters of mine. Who are the least? The king himself calls the least the ones in prison, the ones sick, the ones that are addicted, the ones that are oppressed, the ones that are sad, the ones that are holding up signs trying to get people to pay attention to their pain. These are siblings of Jesus Christ. That's an amazing verse. And this has caused consternation for theologians because they go, hold on a second, wait a minute. How could they be siblings of Christ? That would make them children of God, but they can't be children of God if they haven't become a Christian. Because there's a verse in John 1:12, a very important verse, I've mentioned it to you guys before, that says, for all who received him, who all believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. John 1:12, look it up later. And in John 1:12, only those who trust Christ become children of God. If you don't trust Christ, then by definition, you are not a child of God. So what's this talking about? Do you know what an acorn is? I'm going to ask you a question, you guys. Class time. Is an acorn an oak tree? The wrong answer, Dave. Come on. No. An acorn is an oak tree? Gonna be, maybe, but you know what? If you bring me, Dave's my friend, we're okay. He likes me and he's taller, okay? But you know what? If you and I go out and we get an acorn, we go, this is a cool acorn. Okay, we're going to leave it here. We're going to put it up on the expand your table thing that's getting finished out there. We're going to put that up there. And we'll leave that sitting up there for the next 20 years until you and I are well into our 40s. Okay. Will that acorn ever become an oak tree? No. An acorn is not an oak tree. It is an imminent oak tree. Given all the right circumstances, God has created that acorn to become an oak tree. And the fullness of that acorn is to become an oak tree. It's an imminent oak tree. So what are the least? What are the vulnerable? What are the non-believers? What are the violent people? What are the brokenhearted? What are the prisoners? What are the sick folks, the hungry ones? What are they? They can't be children of God if they don't have faith in Christ. They're not part of our body. And hospitality so often to us is extreme hospitality towards people like us. But Matthew 25 does not give us that luxury because every single human person is an imminent child of God. Like an acorn is an imminent oak tree, every person was created to live forever in God's household as created, and he's longing for the day that each one of them will come into his arms and jump into his lap as the king. And that's what Jesus is saying here. Who are the children? The imminent children of God that Jesus identifies with. See, he identifies a family relationship with each human person. And when we listen to the voices, when we let the anger and the vitriol and the perspectives come pounding at us from all different sides, it's so easy for us to miss what the King has to say to us of who we are. I got to ask myself, Chap, am I living a life of a goat? I long to be a sheep. If you know Jesus Christ, to love Jesus Christ means we go where he has gone. We go to look for him. We don't allow any voice. We don't allow any perspective. We don't allow any persuasion to separate us from the voice of Jesus Christ, especially in Matthew 25, because these least belong to him and they're his siblings. That's who we are. I get asked a lot in my network, which is pretty fun. Because you guys are famous. They love St. Andrews. People have heard about St. Andrews. You guys are well known, especially you guys. Clark's unbelievable. And they go, how's it going there? What are they like? Newport Beach, they've seen you on TV, you know. You know what I'm saying? Okay, you do. And I go, you know what? They're among the greatest group of people I've ever been around. The leadership, the staff, congregation, this has been a great ride. I'm telling you, Dee and I have been so touched by the beauty and wonder of this crowd. But I do have to ask, is this church imminent sheep? Are we an acorn? Willing and ready to do whatever it takes to look the King in the eye and follow him. Matthew 25 invites us to reflect on how deep our trust in Jesus Christ goes. I want so desperately to be a sheep.